Let's go ahead and get into our tasks for today. So for Module 6, 6.1, we'll begin by taking a look at iOS MTP, and we're instructed to provision both the corporate headquarter, Router 1, and Branch 1, which is Router 2 routers, to support media termination point services for up to 50 concurrent sessions. However, we're instructed not to use any DSPs to accomplish this task, and to enable support on these MTPs for both RSVP protocol, which we looked at in call admission control, and trusted relay point. And what's trusted relay point? Well, take a look at what that is. So, taking a look at our corporate headquarter router, let's begin by jumping into configuration T. And in order to begin anything related to DSP farm, we did mention that we need DSP services, DSP farm on the voice card, right? But wait a minute. We were instructed not to use any DSPs to accomplish this task. So we don't need to and don't want to do anything with DSP farm or DSP services, DSP farm, anything at all on the voice card interface because we're not using any DSPs. So now we need to take a look at, all right, well, what do we need for DSP farm commands? Well, we've got the ability to create transcoder, conference bridge. We don't see MTP, though. Well, that's because DSP farm conference bridge and DSP farm transcoder were the old commands that were used for the old PVDM original generation 1. PVDM 1s, even though they were just called PVDMs. So we don't use those commands if we're not dealing with the original Gen 1 PVDMs. For PVDM 2s, we create DSP farm profiles. So we assign a tag, profile ID, and then we have the ability to configure conference, MTP for media termination point, and transcoding. So let's configure MTP. Anything else? We could have security, but we're not dealing with security. We have a module all of its own. Now we see so far resource provider not registered. Okay? So in other words, the provider that's going to be, or the person that's going to be providing the resources to us, CUCM server, isn't yet registered. So we have to do that, and those are related to the skinny or SCCP commands, seeing as all DSP farm resources are registered to CUCM servers using, of course, their proprietary and very flexible, scalable because it's proprietary, they can add anything they want to it, protocol. So we'll get into that in just a little bit. So for right now, we're in our DSP farm profile, and we can actually, let's just go ahead and do show run type 2 section for DSP farm. And we see that by default, we've got a single codec of G711 MULA, and it's shut down. Any DSP farm profile that you create will be shut down by default. Now, we can only have one codec active at any one time in an MTP if we're not using any sort of DSP resources, really just in MTPs in general. If we need to have multiple codecs in any sort of an MTP, that's where we have to get into the idea of a transcoder. So a transcoder, hopefully everyone understands, but just for a basic refresher, is the ability to take any codec, or hopefully we'll actually discuss which ones can be transcoded to which others, but a certain type of a codec, be it voice codecs or be them video codecs, and take them and transfer them, or transpose them is actually a better way to say it, typically refers to music, but we can transpose them into another codec. Call it transcoding because they are codecs. Codec being CO and then DEC, so codec being compress and decompress. Codec stands for. Shortened terminology for. So transcoding is going from one codec to another codec. It could even be going from one codec to the same codec, but at different sampling rates. It's possible that using the theorem that was used to sample the audio source or possibly video source, that they were at different rates. Okay, so maybe for voice, G729, for instance, we might have a 20 millisecond sampling rate on one G729 stream and a 30 millisecond sampling rate on another audio stream, another G729 stream. So that needs a transcoder. Sometimes that can be done in an MTP if they're the same actual codec. CUCM has its own MTPs for every server in the cluster that you enable the IP voice media streaming app service on. It has 4 media resources, all we'll talk about and show today: Annunciator, Conference Bridge, MTP, and Music on Hold Server. These MTPs can only speak G711 MULA or G711A law. The MTPs on the iOS router can only speak one at a time. However, we do have the ability to change what codec that is. So right now, by default, it's G711 MULA. If we're going to use it over the WAN, especially for RSVP, which we talked about in terms of call admission control, where we do actually have to terminate the media, then we will probably, over the WAN, choose the G729 codec. So transcoders deal with transcoding between codecs, changing formats, changing not only codecs but sampling rates. MTPs, first of all, transcoders can not only perform transcoding, but they can act also as an MTP. So they can do both functions. However, the converse is not true. An MTP cannot act as a transcoder. It can only support one codec at a time or pass-through, which essentially means that we're not changing anything with the codec. We just need to have the resources of an MTP. So what is an MTP? A media termination point. The ability exists there to terminate media, to terminate the RTP stream, in order to provide what? Well, a lot of things. We typically say supplementary services. But what does supplementary services really mean? Well, let's get into some of the documentation and take a look. Okay, so here's the link that we have on the desktop by default. Now, actually, if we're looking at the SRND, that is actually a PDF on your desktop. So I probably will go back to the PDFs simply because all the other documentation, administration guide, system guide, features and services guide, where we could find some good information, is certainly there for you to search for you to navigate to, I should better say. But the SRNDs, CUCM SRND, the CUCM-E, or Call Manager Express SRND, and the QoS SRND are all going to be PDFs on your desktop. That much is guaranteed. So if we take a look and we jump down to the media resources, we've got information about voice termination in general. This is where we can get into looking at the codecs that we were just talking. Whoops, scrolling a little bit too fast. A lot too fast, actually. Back up to the top. Okay, media resources. As we scroll down and we take a look at voice termination, this is where we can, in the SRND, find out information about medium and high complexity codecs, Flex, as we just talked about, DSP resources for voice termination. Some of these are things that we just looked at. DSP resources on hardware iOS platforms based on the C5510 chipset, which is what we have for a PVDM2. Okay, continued. Various other chipsets, 5421, so that's an older PVDM2. 549, that's an older PVDM1. Okay, 542. So these are DSPs that are directly on a network module, and actually the 55 or 5421, I misspoke, is directly on modules as well. Okay, so we're not going to go into all those. We looked at all those to some degree. We get into audio conferencing. We get into video conferencing, secure transcoding. We just talked about information about transcoding, and I'm going to provide links to all of these individual sections. Transcoding resources, so we're looking at some hardware, and then we look at MTP. So the idea of MTP is that it accepts two full duplex media streams, it bridges those streams together, and allows them to be set up and torn down independently, and that gives us the ability to have what we call supplementary services. So what are these supplementary services? Well, they can be a number of different things. So they can be repacketization of a stream. So for instance, taking G711A law to G711 mu law. They're the same codec, G711. Okay? It's just the formation of the A law versus mu law that we're using to repacketize an existing codec. DTMF conversion. This is something that a number of people forget about that needs an MTP to occur. If we've got two different types of DTMF, so let's say we've got a DTMF relay which is named telephony events, aka RFC 2833, sometimes that's how it's referred to, routers, or even in CUCM. These are a method of sending DTMF from one endpoint to another after the call's been established, but the tones are actually sent as packet data, so it's out of band in a sense, but they're using the RTP stream. So what they are not doing is they're not sending in a H225 or H245, more specifically header for H323. They're not sending a SIP signaling for SIP notify or something like that. They are not sending using the signaling protocol. They're actually sent in the RTP stream, but they're not audio sampled. Okay, so this is not the same thing as in-band Cisco proprietary RTP or Cisco RTP for DTMF relay. This is not in-band. This is true out of band, but it's in the RTP stream. Because of that, we actually have to terminate the RTP in order to get the information out. Okay, so it's sent in the data payload, sent as out of band, reliable ones and zeros, versus being sampled by the audio codec, which would meet with complete disaster if the audio codec was G729, for instance. It doesn't have a wide enough frequency spectrum to handle the dual tone multi-frequency range. We also have keypad or key press markup language. By the way, I should mention NTE or RFC 2833 is supported in both SIP and H323. KPML or key press markup language is just supported for SIP. We have SIP unsolicited notify. So it's a SIP notify message, but it was not requested or solicited by either side that already has a call up. So it's an unsolicited notify. It wasn't requested, but it will accept the notify. We also have H245 signal and H245 alphanumeric. So these are H323 specific. KPML and unsolicited notify are SIP specific. H245 is, of course, the media control protocol used to negotiate H323 after an H225 call setup message has been established. We'll look more at that tomorrow with gateways and trunks. And we'll look more at it as well on Thursday with gatekeeper. But H245 also provides an out-of-band channel for DTMF transport. Now, most people use H245 alphanumeric in their DTMF relay commands. However, the signal method actually carries more information about the DTMF event, such as the duration. So it's going to be a better choice to always use H245 signal if you're choosing an out-of-band, something other than DTMF, NTE, named telephony events, or RFC 2833, depending on how it's referenced. Keep in mind, if we're using NTE, we must have a MTP. So if both sides support H.245 signal, that's better, because we do not need an MTP if we're just going from, let's say, an H.323 gateway that supports H.245 signal, and they all do, and a, let's say, the CUCM H.323 gateway page or even H.225 trunk page. They support H.245 signal, so why would we use something that requires an MTP when both sides support the same thing and it's not in an RTP packet? We wouldn't. It limits the necessity for invoking additional CPU intensive or just even in general expensive and limited resources. There's Cisco proprietary RTP. The gateways support this, but CUCM does not support it. Okay? Not supported by CUCM, but it is supported on the iOS gateways. And then the skinny control protocol, it actually supports out-of-band DTMF itself. So mainly we need an MTP if we're using either some form of an in-band or named telephony events RFC 2833, or if we're going between the two. Okay, so this is going to go in, and I'm not going to read the whole thing, of course, to you. It actually tells you which phones, based on the skinny stack or the SIP stack for various types of phones, support the various methods. By the way, most skinny phones do support, at least the newer ones, not the old ones, actually Conference Bridge as well, or the conferencing phone, rather, do support named telephony events. So if both sides are supporting NTE, then we typically don't need an MTP, okay, as long as both sides would support it. But anytime we have a disparate type of DTMF relay, then we're going to need it. Okay. Also, we need MTPs, media termination point, if we want to provide SIP early offer in outgoing messages. So note that they're not, MTP resources are not required for an incoming invite message, whether they contain an initial offer or not. So we'll talk more about this tomorrow, but just very briefly, SIP early offer versus SIP delayed media. Those can be somewhat analogous to H3 or H.225 fast start is analogous to SIP early media versus H.225 slow start, which is somewhat analogous to SIP delayed media, okay, or early offer. So the idea of an early offer or a fast start just means that in the initial setup message, for SIP, it would be the 100 trying message. For H.225, it would be the setup message. We're going to describe DTMF and codec capabilities and hope that the other side can really fall in line with what we're requesting. And if so, we don't need to negotiate anything. If we're initiating from the CUCM side an early offer, we need an MTP. But note that the initial offer is limited to G711 only. So if you want to support G729 over a SIP trunk, which became available in CUCM 7.0, in fact we'll show tomorrow, then you do need to not use your SIP early offer. And again, it's using a resource, an MTP, you might want to conserve. In the lab, you're going to do what you're told, but you are going to probably be given information. As we've mentioned many times, you're going to be given tasks related to how something should be accomplished, not what to do, and also using wording that specifies the capabilities of what they're asking you to do. Okay, so if they said set up a SIP trunk, use any codec, do not use MTPs. For instance, you wouldn't be able to do SIP early offer. You also wouldn't be able to support G729. G729 does require an MTP. And we'll talk more tomorrow about, we're going to talk a lot more tomorrow about MTPs because they relate very heavily as you can see already, even just in our initial discussion today, they relate very heavily back and forth to gateways and trunks, whether they're provisioned manually enforced or automatically negotiated. Okay, so it gives a lot of information about MTPs when they're needed, configuring DTMF, looking at H323 trunks and gateways, looking at the necessity for an MTP regarding supplementary services. Okay, Cisco Call Manager uses internally with its Skinny endpoints, which Skinny was based on H323, as we'll actually take a look at an example of that today with media and the enunciator. The CUCM server uses the H245 ECS, or Empty Capability Set. Okay? However, there are many endpoints, such as CME, that, or gateways, you could look at it as, that use by default H450, H.450.2 and H450.3 for supplementary services being call, hold, and call transfer. And don't hold me to whether 450.2 is hold and 450.3 is transfer. I believe that's the way it is, but it could be the opposite way around. And then H450.12 being the description of which, what subset of H450 we're going to be using. Those came around a lot later than CUCM, or at the time, Call Manager Celsius, had been developed and deployed, and so they've continued to use a very reliable empty capability set within their Skinny endpoints, and by default out to gateways. However, H450 can be used, it's just that CUCM won't support it, so we can, that's actually where we'll get into in a few weeks, the cube module, border element. But an MTP can be required if the other side does not support ECS. Okay, so let's say we're talking to a CME over a trunk, and we're actually going to have an entire deep dive module just on CUCM to Call Manager Express, CUCME, internetworking, because there's so much that can be discussed there and so many possibilities for failure, but so many obviously possibilities for success if it's configured right. We have enough to cover an entire day. But let's just say a CME is not wanting to, or call manager is wanting to do a call, hold, or transfer to a call on a CME over an H323 trunk. Call manager doesn't support the H450.3 for the transfer. We will invoke an MTP so that we can provide H245 capabilities over the other side, being the ECS. CME speaks that with the CCM compatible command. We'll take a look at that later, but the important point being that we need a media termination point if we want to provide services to something that cannot essentially redirect that transfer. So one of the things about H450.3 with transfer is that it actually goes back to the original endpoint and says redirect your call somewhere else, versus empty capability set just does this open logical and closed logical channel, the OLC. So it's not actually redirecting the originating gateway and the terminating gateway, or originating and terminating endpoints, to the new transfer. It's not saying to the originating gateway, redirect over to the new terminating gateway. It's essentially needing an MTP to terminate that media and provide a hairpin. 450 enhances the capabilities of, but we need an MTP if we're using call, hold, and transfer for between multiple CMEs and a call manager. Okay, if we're just going between one call manager and one CME, we're not using between multiple call managers and multiple CME clusters. So I'm talking about 3 separate cluster endpoints at this point. If we're only involving 2 separate endpoints, then we don't need an MTP to provide supplementary services, as long as it's a Cisco iOS gateway, Cisco iOS router, which of course CME runs on. If we're using outbound fast connect, just like if we're doing SIP early media, then an MTP is required. However, for inbound fast start, just like with a SIP early media invite to us, the CUCM, we do not need an MTP. So again, it's very important to consider what is necessary in terms of resources, certainly when you're deploying live customer or internal networks, but then also in terms of specifically what is supported, when is an MTP needed, in the case of the CCI Voice Lab, where they're going to word things very specifically that will test your knowledge of when something would be needed. Okay, as we mentioned, when both endpoints are SIP and NTE is used, no MTP is required. When one endpoint is SIP and supports the other, both KPML, key press markup language, or keypad markup language, some people refer to it as, and name telephony events, but the other endpoint is not SIP, such as H323. Typically, DTMF is KPML, and the H245 is used on the trunk, and no MTP is actually required for this DTMF. One side is SIP and supports NTE, the other is not SIP. H245 is used in the trunk, then an available MTP is allocated for the call. Again, it's good to read through this and understand what is the best practice configuration, when what is needed. I'm not going to read every single thing, but I will provide the links. And again, this is just one more reason to read every single one of the 1094, basically 1,100 pages in the SR&D. It's packed full of good information. Now, looking at a trusted relay point. So a trusted relay point is an MTP. Well, actually, first, before I go on to enhanced MTP functions, does anyone have any questions so far about what MTPs are in general? So an MTP terminates media. We know that much. We know it's typically used for supplementary services. What is this new thing called a trusted relay point? Well, a trusted relay point is an MTP. It does terminate the media. It can be inserted into a media stream to act as a control point for that stream. And the idea, the main reason behind it that we would use is as a QoS enforcement mechanism, or also for voice security. And then one other thing is for traversing, let's say, firewall, NAT, or even VRFs, so virtual routing and forwarding, virtual routing instances within an iOS router or between iOS routers would, typically between iOS routers, VRFs would be used with MPLS. So if we have VRFs in our data center, if we have some form of maybe an ASA, in fact, let me whiteboard this, might help to communicate the a little better. We're not going to be looking at MTPs today other than we were given a task to configure one, but we're not going to, well, we might just for a test. But let's say we have a phone here and a phone over here. And this phone is in the sales department, 1001. And this phone is in the, I don't know, research and development department. It's extension 59. And there's actually now, first of all of these are a part of the same CUCM cluster. They're all one CUCM cluster. But there's a firewall in between these phones. Now let's say that this is a large company and this sales phone here actually represents 450 phones on this side. And this R&D phone actually represents 7,600 phones. We've just got an immense amount of phones in between or on either side of this firewall. So somewhere the CUCM, pub and sub sit, but those really aren't too relevant here to what we're doing. In terms of when calls flow, well, actually, let's draw the CUCM pub and sub. Probably have multiple servers at this point. So sub 1, sub 2, sub 3. We really don't need the pub because these are the three CPEs that are going to be used for signaling back and forth. And so they're going to provide skinny-based signaling and back and forth between each other. They're providing their ICCS signaling. So we can poke holes in the firewalls for 3 subscribers, or maybe they're sitting in some sort of a subnet, or not subnet, but DMZ that has security rights to everywhere. Or we could use TRPs even for those. So the idea with TRP, if we want media to flow between these phones, signaling always goes back and forth between the endpoints and the CUCM servers, right? Never goes between the endpoints themselves, even if they speak the same protocol. Never. But the media typically goes directly. Okay, the RTP stream. Before we had that firewall there, it would just go directly back and forth. I just don't want to erase it. That's where the RTP stream needs to flow. However, the only problem is we've got this firewall in the way. Drawn it before I had the firewall. So since we've got this firewall in the way, we need to be able to somehow traverse the firewall. Now, I could open up the IP address range in subnet for 7,600 phones over here and 4,500 phones over here, times the fact that for UDP RTP ports, I have 16,003, wait, what is it, 16, forgot the number, 16,384 to 16,767, or actually, sorry, to 32,767. So I've got 16,000 plus ports. I've got 16,000 plus ports times roughly 8,000 phones. That's a lot of holes in my firewall. Even if I can summarize those with groups and named objects, I just probably don't want to as a security administrator. So instead, I say that even for phones that are talking to each other, they need to invoke a special entity called an MTP, a media termination point, that's used as a trusted relay point. Okay, so it's kind of a special MTP called a trusted relay point. So now, all of that traffic can be terminated on that MTP. And what do I need to do? I only need to open up the MTP, or maybe I have one MTP on either side. I only need to open those 16,000 possible ports up for that one MTP, that one trusted relay point. So this allows me to traverse firewalls, much more easily traverse NAT and PAT, traverse, whether it's ASA, Cisco iOS firewalls, to be able to traverse VRFs, to be able to deal with one side being secure RTP, the other side being non-secure RTP. Not that that's necessarily a great thing, because you kind of kill the idea of security. Well, at least you have it on one side of your communication. Maybe the more important side, the R&D or something highly confidential. Okay, but we have the ability to provide this media termination point even for internal phones or internal gateways. So that's the important thing, is by default, internal phones don't use MTPs when talking to each other unless, of course, as we mentioned, we're dealing with DTMF, but then again, we can deal with that with the CUCM. So for all media, we have the ability to traverse this trusted relay point. Okay, we also have an enunciator, and an enunciator is what typically provides us with error messages such as your call cannot be completed as dialed, please check the number and call again, or you've exceeded your precedence level, or whatever the message is that we choose when we block a call. We'll take a look at that today. The one important thing to note is that the device must be capable, since the enunciator actually uses skinny messages to initiate that RTP stream, the device must be capable of SCCP to utilize this feature. Okay, it's capable of supporting G711, ALAW, MULA, and 729 wideband without any transcoding, but it has to be a skinny endpoint that it's talking to. So what does this mean? SIP phones don't get enunciator. MGCP gateways don't get enunciator. Goes on and tells us a little more about the enunciator. The RSVP agent, very similar to the very similar to the trusted relay point, but for a totally different reason. We mentioned this briefly, or we mentioned this more, actually, I should say. We'll mention it briefly here, but we mentioned it more in depth when we talked about call admission control. So if I've got a phone here at headquarters, and I've got a phone over here at branch 1, and I have my, this is connected to LAN, of course connected to its LAN. Got a router here, headquarter router, and we've got a frame relay or some sort of WAN connection, and I want to provide call admission control. Does the media path already have to traverse this link in order to get to the branch 1 phone? Okay, MTP, rather RTP. That RTP traffic already has to traverse this router, or if there's redundant, resilient routers, multiple paths, it has to traverse some IP path. So the MTP is, or the RTP traffic, the real-time protocol media, is already flowing across some router in order to get to the other side. If it is, will it hurt us to simply terminate this media here and terminate it on the other side? If all we're doing is repacketizing it in the exact same codec, the exact same signaling rate or sampling rate rather, 30 milliseconds, what have you, we're not really using that many resources just to terminate the media and repacketize it at the exact same codec and sampling rate, exact same DTMF. So it doesn't really hurt to do that. And because on the router we can run MTP in either hardware, which does hurt because it costs us DSP resources, or we can do it as our first task has instructed us, and we're getting ready to actually configure, in software. So not to use any DSP resources, but instead to use the command we're going to look at, maximum session software, which is only available for MTP in iOS. So we're not using any hardware DSP resources here. We're doing it all in iOS software, so it's a little bit of additional CPU, little bit of a latency, but not anything noticeable. It's negligible. But the ability, or the reason that we want to do this, is because we can use that terminated media to trigger the RSVP reservation protocol for bandwidth call admission control. So we trigger that on both sides to provide our path and signaling messages back and forth for RSVP to determine, is there enough bandwidth to allow the call to continue. We don't actually, with RSVP, we mentioned this with QoS, at least with the diff-serve model, we do not actually reserve the physical bandwidth as the data plan. We only reserve the bandwidth as it's related to the control plane, as it relates to calls being controlled and allowed back and forth. But that's the idea of why we would want to use an MTP with RSVP capabilities. Now, if two endpoints actually require RSVP capabilities and a trusted relay point, then first an MTP that's configured as both, supporting both, is attempted to be found. So sometimes it can be a good idea, especially if you're using TRPs in any form or fashion, to have your RSVPs capable of TRP as well. So we already mentioned the IP voice media streaming app being the service that provides the 4 built-in software functionality. Give careful considerations to situations that require these resources because they place a load, CPU load, on the servers that are running them. Typically, we will want music on hold, unicast or multicast, and annunciator. But software conference bridging and software MTP can be a fine thing if we don't have enough iOS software resources, but it's probably better to use those. Software conference bridging is typically something we will not want to do unless we're just desperate. Again, these two, software conference bridge and MTP, in the CUCM IP voice media streaming app, only support the G711 MU-law and G711 A-law protocols or codecs. Do not support G729. Music on hold and annunciator do support G729 and wideband. Okay, so again, this is where, and it gets into capabilities for PVDMs, PVDM2s based on your hardware and so forth. So it's a good idea to read through that and certainly understand that information.